going to make some brief introductions, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to Melissa Collins, who is our Arkansas Realtors Association Risk Reduction Chair this year, and she has done a phenomenal job heading up that committee. LaDonna, if you would wave. LaDonna is the Risk Reduction Liaison with the ARA, and she has traveled here from Little Rock to be with us today. To my right, our attorney for 40 plus years, I believe, Tim Grooms. We're so grateful that you're here. Our ARA president, Jennifer Welch. Northwest Arkansas Board of Realtors president, Heather Keenan. Executive Director of the Arkansas Real Estate Commission, Andrea Alford. And past Chair of the Real Estate Commission, Doyle Yates. And you all are not here to hear me, so I'm going to turn this over to Melissa Collins.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am Melissa Collins, and I've been privileged to be the chair of the Arkansas Risk Reduction Committee this year. As we all know, it has turned into a year that none of us anticipated on the front end. But, you know, I can't help but just be proud of our Arkansas Realtors Association and how well they support our practitioners, our realtors, our brokers across the state of Arkansas. And I greatly value the relationship that we have with the Arkansas Real Estate Commission and Andrea and her involvement, and she's been very involved with us on this PAG, and Andrea, we greatly appreciate you for that, and Tim, we appreciate you for your involvement in everything that we've done this year in order to comply with the antitrust settlement. So with that being said, we do have a disclosure that we need to read. It's called the antitrust avoidance, and I need to read it in its entirety, so bear with me. Meeting attendees are reminded that state and federal laws prohibit the exchange of information among competitors regarding matters pertaining to price, refusals to deal, market division, tying relationships, and other topics which might infringe upon antitrust regulations, and that no such exchange or discussion will be tolerated during this meeting. These guidelines apply not only to the formal meeting sessions, but informal discussions during breaks, meals, or social gatherings, or basically anytime you walk through your community and encounter other realtors. These discussions are a point of antitrust, so we need to always be very careful to comply with that. All of the people that are on the panel, plus some additional members, have been working all year on a PAG, a presidential appointed group that has been working since last year, following the NAR's lawsuit and verdict and settlement agreement that we are going to be putting in place. The deadline to put everything in place is August the 17th. So that's 11 days from today. So there's going to be some things presented today that you've got to really wrap your mind around. There's some things that you've really got to talk to your principal broker about to find out what your office, how your office is going to handle some of these changes that we're seeing. But the members of the PAG, the ones who have already been introduced, of course, LaDonna, Tim, Doyle, Heather, Suzette, President Welch, and Andrea. And then we also have Andy Myers, who is a member of the Hot Springs Board of Realtors, and he will be at some of the future meetings that we're going to have on the panel there. He wasn't able to travel here today. We also want to recognize our AP subcommittee of the risk reduction, and our full Risk Reduction Committee. Our full Risk Reduction Committee has 100 members in it from across the state. Normally, AP has a meeting to look at the changes, and then the full risk reduction comes to Little Rock to review those changes and make their recommendations before it's presented to the board in June. Then, sometime in June, that committee is completely finished, usually, for their work for this year. Well, with the antitrust, all of those members have been asked to come to Little Rock for additional meetings beyond the scope of what they normally do. And so with that, I'd like to say that I greatly appreciate everyone that's been involved in that. We are very fortunate to have LaDonna as our ARA liaison. Her years of experience have allowed us to evolve a process that she has put in place that makes all of these changes so much more streamlined. So as you can imagine, when we see the number of contracts that are going to have mid-year changes, you are going to, I want you to think about how all of these contracts interconnect, the addendums and disclosures and different pieces of that, and how they interconnect through paragraph numbers, addendums, disclosures, etc. So we will, we have really had to look at those with a much finer tooth comb this year, and I greatly appreciate LaDonna because the bulk of that has fallen on her, and I would absolutely be cross-eyed right now, but she's just as beautiful as ever right there. This year, there have been what I'm going to use the word regular with these quotation marks, regular risk reduction changes that we normally do. Those went through the normal process, easy peasy, okay? But then there was the second part of this, which is the antitrust changes. So we are going to run through the regular risk reduction changes first. And with that being said, I want to make everyone aware that when these contracts are available sometime between now and August the 17th, they will show up in your Form Simplicity portal. The new contracts will. The regular risk reduction changes are changing at the same time. Okay, so in 2025, on January 1, when you get your new contracts, those shouldn't have any changes in it unless something happens with the settlement and the law between now and January 1. Okay, so we're making all those changes mid-year. So in the upper right-hand corner of our contracts, where the copyright is, that's where that number always changes from 2024 to 2025 or 2023 to 2024. Here's our code so that you know which ones have changed. You will have 2024 with an R after it, so that means it's been revised. Or if the 2024 has an N after it, that means it's a completely new contract. Okay? If it has neither of those, then it didn't have any changes. And then in January, everything will then just have a standard 2025 on it. Okay? So that's a little code there to help you with that. Now, we do have some new forms, and those are on the overhead here and in the scan that you should have received the email scan of the Dropbox of these changes. So you have, we have a couple of new forms, and then we have one new form that is new just till December 2024. till December 31, 2024. And I'll explain those whenever we get to those. Okay, now we have, if you're following along in a scan, or you can follow on the screen, page 3, 4, and 5 is a list of all of our Arkansas contracts that we have, all of them. And the first column, after the name of the contract, is mid-year changes, where there were changes because of the settlement, because of the antitrust settlement. And then the last column is just identifying if there was a regular antitrust change, okay? And we're not going to spend any time on that, but this is a really good reference to keep at your desk if you want to know if anything did change. Okay, now we're going to talk about regular antitrust changes, and we'll be on these are the due passes, this will be on page 7 of your scan. And a form formerly known as Condo Townhome Addendum, we have renamed that because it needs to be utilized for more than just a condo or townhome. So this particular form's new name is Owners Association Addendum, and it has been rewritten to allow you to utilize it if you are helping a buyer who is moving into a community where there is an HOA or a POA. So you can now utilize this form, whether it's just a single-family residential house or whether it is a condo or a townhome. Okay, so that is just a really good regular change that needs to take place. Now, something that I probably should say on the front end, I know a lot of y'all are probably not used to looking at red lines. That's how these changes take place. LaDonna makes the changes with red lines and marks things out and strike through and that kind of thing. There's some codes there that help you identify that. You just need to be you just need to be aware that there's also a black line that follows. So if you're following along, you can scroll to the black line if it looks confusing to you, okay? So the next regular change is page 12 and 13 is the documents acknowledgement for buyers and documents acknowledgement for sellers. And I feel like this one's better viewed from page 15 where the black line is. We had several requests for people who utilize this form to prove that they have given copies to their clients. They want to date the day that they give them the copy. So we included a column where they can place the date, the day that they give their client the copy. Now, this gives a practitioner, or I guess I should say a principal broker, under your principal broker's guidance, the ability to make decisions about how you want to utilize this. If you're going to give them final copies throughout the process and you want to record that you gave it to them on a certain date, you have that ability. If you're like me, and I prefer to give everybody a complete package towards the end near the closing, well, I then just mark which ones are available and have them initial out to the side, but then I get them to sign it at the bottom for the date that I gave it to them. I don't have them date every single line, but you have that option if you want to record the date that you actually gave it to them and allow them to initial. So that's just a pretty simple, easy change, but I wanted to point out that you can utilize it however you want to for the best practice. Let's turn to page 19. Page 19 is the permission to show agreement. It came to our attention that there wasn't a place for the seller's email, and we felt like you guys needed to have the option to put their email on this for a permission to show. So we felt like that was a really great request, whoever sent that in, and we utilized that. Now, page 22 is in reference on the real estate contract residential. It's on paragraph 11 about the survey. Okay? We changed the wording out beside B on the survey to say that no, or buyer declines survey. We felt that wording was more clear, and it gave you as a practitioner a better opportunity to have a conversation with your buyer about the dangers of foregoing a survey. And then we added some red line wording in the bold under this last paragraph in paragraph 11. Should buyer agree to accept the most recent survey provided by seller, which shall be for information purposes only, or should buyer decline a new surveyor, buyer will not be entitled to the legal benefits of a survey certified in buyer's name. And I think this is the very definition of our risk reduction committee, and what we do is work to improve these contracts each year and eliminate our risk as well as risk for the consumer and for our clients. So that's one of the regular changes. Then another important regular change that's on the real estate contract residential is in paragraph 14, which is the contingency paragraph. You know, 14 has, if it's contingent upon another house selling or another condition not addressed here in the contract, you have the option to choose binding with escape, which allows the seller to keep showing and keep accepting backup offers, and or to force the buyer to remove the contingency and move on forward with purchasing the home, or binding without escape. Within this, the paragraph actually stated that you didn't have to do the inspection, you didn't have to, if you were the buyer, you didn't have to do the inspection, you didn't have to start your loan process. Basically, you could hold the property under contract without having to do anything to move towards purchasing it until your house closed. Well, most buyers are not going to remove that contingency until their house closes. Well, legally, we had no recourse to have them go ahead and move through these other steps if they didn't remove the contingency. So the day of closing on the same day, really, we could have gotten ourselves in a pickle there with that. So this now, you have a box, buyer removes the contingency, and all the time constraints get started when the buyer removes the contingency, or they have to start on those paragraphs, paragraph 6, 16B, 17, 18, 19B, 20B, and 21, upon the time that this contract is accepted. Okay, so you have a choice there to mark those boxes. I think that's also a really good change. Now, the next, starting on page 28 and going all the way through to page 39, the short sale addendums that many of agents probably utilized a lot in 07 and 08 when these were first created had not been changed since then, had not been looked at, had not been addressed. And some of the short sale laws and lending laws had changed since the Great Recession in 07 and 08. And so we had a task force that had the original chair of the task force and an additional member who worked on the task force to rewrite this. Since there's not a large number of us who do short sale, I'm not going to spend time going over these. But if you are someone who works in short sales, be sure and read through these, because there's been a lot of changes within that. And reach out to me by email or phone with any questions that you have, and I'll probably put you in touch with the task force chair, okay? So that you can get those questions answered, and we know that those will probably evolve. Okay, now we're on page 40. And on page 40, this is a new contract that has been requested. As you know, we have the ability to find a tenant for an owner. Usually, we're managing the property when we find that tenant for the owner, usually, but not always. From time to time, you know, our offices are called and they say, hey, I can't find a renter. I'd love to pay you to help me find a renter, because I know you have access to people that would be good potential renters. Well, this allows you to enter into agreement with that owner to actually get paid a commission for helping that owner find a tenant for their property. And there are some things that I just want to point your attention to, page 42. And when we met with the brokers this morning, paragraph 7, we emphasized that your brokers need to have a policy about which one of those 5 services is okay for your office to provide an owner in that case. And we particularly want to point out the IV, the number 4 item, to prepare and execute a residential lease agreement. That doesn't mean that you should utilize the ARA form for a residential lease, because you're not managing the property. That is a lease between the owner and the tenant. And if you're willing to explain that to a potential tenant on behalf of the owner, we're suggesting that you utilize a lease that has been provided to you by the owner, and that you not use our copyrighted contracts for that. We see the potential for some risk there. So that's what we recommended to the brokers. And if you're going to use this form, make sure you've talked to your broker and your broker tells you how they want you to handle that, if that's something that your company is willing to do. Then on page 49, 48 and 49, we have a new form called the Implied Residential Quality Standards. In what'd y'all say this morning, 2017, 2021? Okay, somewhere in there, 2019 to 2021, the Arkansas legislature passed 6 quality standards that an owner had to provide a tenant. And those 6 standards are listed here. And the law required that we disclose that to the tenants, what those 6 were, and give them an opportunity to come back and tell you if any of those 6 are not present. Okay, so that's what this form is for. Some brokerages across the state had created their own form with their lawyer in order to comply with the law that was changed. And we felt like this was a good thing to provide our practitioners so that they can comply. And if you look at the bottom, the 6 items disclosing what they are, and if those 6 items are not available when they pick up the keys from you and go to the property, they've got 2 business days to to notify you that one of them is not there. And if that's the case, then on page 50, they would fill in which one of those. Now, let me emphasize, this is not a punch list of light bulbs not being in, railing being loose, those types of things. This is only for the 6 quality standards that are required by law. So don't, I wouldn't want to fall into creating this being a punch list for you. Now, within your scan on page 52, there are several pages here that is just a really good outline for what we're dealing with this antitrust settlement. This PAG, as I mentioned, has been working since last year, watching and planning and paying attention to what's happening in other states, paying attention to what NAR is coming out with, attending weekly meetings by Zoom that are produced from, put out by NAR, so that we understand how and what we need to do as a state to comply. One of the really cool things is that Arkansas is one of 12 that have not had an antitrust lawsuit filed during this window of time. There is a really good reason for that. Consistency in our legal counsel advice that we've gotten over the years, the process for the antitrust, the process for the Arkansas Risk Reduction Committee, how we utilize that each year, and the fact that our commission, our Arkansas law, already encouraged us to utilize buyer agency agreements. And in utilizing our buyer agency agreements, we may need to adjust how we've been doing it. There's best practice, and we probably need to firm up our best practice, but we've really been in a pretty good place with the laws that we already have in place. And so I'm really proud of the work that we've done. But for you, as a practitioner, how does this antitrust, these changes that have to go in effect August the 17th, how does it affect you? So 2 changes for you as a practitioner. How does this affect you? Number 1, your offer, if you're working with a buyer, your offer of compensation will no longer be on the MLS. And it cannot be anywhere that the IDX feed touches the MLS. So what does that mean to you? You're going to have a conversation with the listing agent. And one of the things that I kept getting, particularly from agents and brokers in this area, as I've discussed this, they say, we can't ever get the listing agent to call us back. How in the world are we going to be able to find what our compensation is? Well, listing agents, we're all both of them, right? In some capacity, we're listing agents, we're buyer's agents. In most cases, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So we're gonna have to go back to an age even before I started in real estate, and I'm kind of old in this room, but we're gonna have to go back to having conversations with the other agent on the other side, and that's gonna be real important for us to be diligent with that. So that's one way that it affects you. The second way that it affects you as a practitioner is that now you must, in order to comply with the settlement, you must have a written agreement to show a property with a buyer. A written agreement. And that's what we're going to be going over. And it has to be done before you tour a home. So best practice, just like best practice for realtor safety, is to meet the buyer at the office and have a conversation with them about your compensation and how realtors get paid, and have a conversation with them about the properties that they want to see and whether or not the seller is going to provide compensation for you to represent them as a buyer, or whether or not they're going to need to provide the compensation to you to represent them as a buyer. So best practice, which is also a good realtor safety practice, is to have a consultation. So just like Tim mentioned, we expect the settlement conditions to continue to evolve. What we know today is probably not what we're going to know 10 to 12 months from now. There'll probably be some changes. So, and especially with what state compliance within their contracts look like. This PAG is going to continue working to monitor that and pay attention. The PAG and the board of directors believe that we're in a great place with the information that we have right now, and we continue to follow and pay attention and make changes as necessary. We are not attempting to overregulate what your broker instructs you to do, but we are working to find the balance for settlement compliance, Arkansas law, and your broker's ability to continue running their business, and with you in your capacity with what you do as an agent, which is a very important part of the work that we do for consumers. Now, on page 53, this is paragraph 58 pulled direct from the settlement. You know, just like with all laws and bills, they're thousands of pages or hundreds or thousands of pages, and it takes somebody to read it all and be able to pull out how we need to apply it. Well, we had Tim for that. Thank you very much. And he pulled out paragraph 58 for us, and he said 58 is where we need to be working to comply. Then also on 55, and in the scan of docs that were sent out, these are blue linked on page 55, blue linked resources to different places in NAR. So LaDonna, move up to page 55. And you can click right on those links and go to those places on the NAR website to read more. So that's a good resource to click on those. Okay, now we're going to be on page 57. Okay, so 57 lists all the contracts that were affected by the antitrust settlement, the Arkansas contracts. And we have them in 5 categories. We're going to review each of these 5 categories, but we are not going to review every single contract under that. And that's what we're going to spend the bulk of our time doing from now till the end of our meeting. So within your scan that you received, there will be a category. Usually it's the residential that we focused on in this presentation, and you will get a red line, and then it will be followed with a black line. Those of you who have not worked on committees like the Risk Reduction Committee are probably not used to those red lines, but the red lines mean there was a change there. A green line means that there was probably a paragraph movement. Not necessarily a change, but a paragraph movement. And so I'm going to teach from the red lines where it's most appropriate. We'll look at the black lines, but I think it's important for you to look at the red lines so that you know where we've made those changes and you can go back and reference those. All right, so these 5 categories. The first one is a one-time addendum for the exclusive right to sell. And this addendum will be here until the end of 2024. So this one-time addendum allows you to go, and you should go and meet with every one of your sellers and get them to sign this addendum.
Really fast, sorry. I wanted to point out that this addendum would be for any listing that is not under contract. So come
Yes.
August 17th, every listing that you have active has to have this addendum signed and in the file. But if it is already under contract, you do not have to do this addendum. Oh, that's right. If something happened and the contract fell apart and it did go back to an active listing, then you would need to have this signed immediately.
Okay. This is the addendum to the exclusive right to sell agreement. Now, you've always negotiated what you do to list, what your X% is to list. And you fill that in here either as a, one-time, combined fee or a percentage in A or B. So that paragraph is there. So let's turn over to the next page, page 2 of 3. And this paragraph is where you can have the cooperative fee conversation with the seller. So if you are going to charge X%, but you're willing to split it, then you need to fill in this next part where it is Y% and Y%, if those are equal numbers, or Y% and Z%. But this is what the conversation you have to have with the seller. But the seller also has the option to not to offer a cooperating fee, because that was a point of the settlement. Okay, next, let's turn to page 66, I believe, the buyer agency agreements. Now, the PAG made some reordering of paragraphs, adjustments throughout these contracts. We wanted to make it easier for you to have conversation with your clients. So we tried to put in the same order, if it was information about compensation, and there were different paragraphs, we tried to put those paragraphs together. If it was paragraphs about, earnest money or surveys or some things like that, we tried to put those in a logical order, which would make it easier. So you will see some paragraph reordering. So what you have memorized on your paragraph numbers, you're going to have to maybe re-memorize some of them. The goal was to streamline the practitioner, you, the realtor, the real estate agent, to be able to streamline your conversation with your client and make it easier for you to do that. Okay, so page 1, page 2, we're going to turn over to page 3 of the Buyer's Agency Representation Agreement. And there's a lot of extra wording that wasn't there before in order to comply with the settlement. So here's what the PAG had discovered as we were walking through this. We discovered a practice of many brokers and agents across the state who chose to put 0 in 5A because they felt they were covered, because the seller usually was offering compensation. Well, that's not the case anymore. Okay? Technically, you should have never put 0 in unless you were willing to represent that buyer for free. Then it would have been okay. So you need to have discussions with your broker. What is the fee that we're charging buyers to represent them? What are you comfortable with me negotiating with my buyers? So you need to have those conversations and put that number in there. Why is that important to you? because of the bold, all caps, right in the middle of that page. It says selling firm will not be paid more than the stated selling firm fee stated without written consent from the buyer. So if you agree to X% to work with your buyer, and you show a property that offers X plus %, you can only collect your X%. Remember, this whole settlement is about disclosure and transparency to the parties so that they understand what's being paid on their behalf and how much they're paying their agent and how much a listing agent is paying on the seller's behalf to the buyer, and getting that agreement in there. Okay, so principal brokers and independent brokerages have the legal ability to set prices for their services. This settlement did not put it in the hands of the licensees. You don't, as a practitioner, as a real estate agent working under a brokerage, have the right to negotiate all of that yourself. You've got to do that within what the policies of the brokerage is. And we're going to read that, starting with the second sentence under that bold paragraph right in the middle, where it says buyer. Buyer is aware that real estate fees are not set by law or regulation. Real estate fees are set by individual firms and therefore may vary from one firm to the next. The fee of selling firm, that's the agent working with the buyer, has been negotiated between selling firm and buyer is aware other licensed real estate firms may charge more or less for similar services than the fee agreed to between buyer and selling firm. This is just basically a full disclosure that everything is negotiable. The next thing, let's look on page 8 of 16, LaDonna, which is page 74 of the scan. Here we have several paragraphs that have been reordered. The fair housing paragraph, the earnest money paragraph, lots of those. So you just need to spend some time and familiarize yourself with that. The closing protection letter paragraph has been reordered. The cost of services, special conditions, that still stayed paragraph number 15, didn't it? So everything, you can keep that memorized, I guess. We want to go over to page 81. Right in the middle, paragraph 22, you will see that these paragraphs will be found in all documents that are affected by the antitrust settlement. These are the class action waivers, and those paragraphs have been worked through the PAG and through Tim's recommendation. And I don't see a need for us to read that and spend time on it in this big meeting, but I would highly recommend you to read it because it is a paragraph that you'll find in every contract now, and you want to be able to explain it to your buyers. Okay, so following this, you have the black line. So the buyer's agency agreement is now going to be 8 pages. And we're going to flip all the way through those and over to the exclusive right to sell. Okay, so the exclusive right to sell agreement affected a large number of our contracts. It affected it at auction, commercial, farm, ranch, and land, lots and acreage, residential. We have a new form that we talked about in the regular real estate changes. That is the exclusive right to lease, and it also affects your permission to show and your property management agreement. So you're going to start seeing those class action paragraphs in all of those starting when they're available to you in Form Simplicity. Okay, so let's review what changed in the exclusive right to sell. So let's turn over to page 2 of the exclusive right to sell. Before, the fees were all in one paragraph. Now they're in separate paragraphs, paragraph 8 and paragraph 9. Paragraph 8 is what you charge to list a property based upon what your principal broker has told you. Okay, whatever that amount is, X percent, if your seller is willing to co-op that, then that co-op is there in 9. So right in the middle of this page, page 93, it says, I want to read the first red line there. Listing firm's fee will be due at the scheduled closing of the transaction. The fee of listing firm has been negotiated between listing firm and seller is aware other licensed real estate brokers may charge more or less than the fee negotiated and agreed to between seller and listing firm. Seller is aware that real estate fees are not set by law or regulation. Sounds a whole lot like the buyer's agency agreement, doesn't it? Except this time it's talking to the seller. We sent this wording to NAR to get their agreement that it was good wording, and so it has been blessed by NAR. All right, so the next paragraph in the red lines there, the second paragraph in the red lines on the screen. I'm going to just read this because sometimes none of us would be guilty of this, but sometimes, you know, we don't read this in great detail. We kind of skip over it. So I'm going to read it so it can sink in. In consideration for seller's promise contained within this agreement, listing firm promises to seller that it will use reasonable effort to market the property and solicit an offer regarding the property with terms and conditions acceptable to seller, provide additional marketing services as deemed appropriate by listing firm, and coordinate the closing. Seller agrees that listing firm is not required to investigate the financial or other ability of a prospective buyer to consummate any proposed or accepted real estate contract. Seller will not owe a fee to listing firm if buyer does not remove any conditions set forth in the real estate contract and cannot close unless the failure to close is the result of breach of a real estate contract by the seller. Okay, so that's some really good wording to help you there too. Now, paragraph 9. This is very important. One of these options must be selected, A or B, to comply with the settlement. If left blank, you risk litigation and not being covered under the settlement if you leave this blank. And also, if there is extra, as you as the listing agent, if there is extra or money left over, you are not able to keep it unless there is an agreement, addendum from the seller. However, that seller agrees to split this or not split it doesn't allow you to keep the excess. The excess stays with the seller.
So the example would be if you negotiated with the seller that you were going to collect X plus Y, and you were planning on keeping X for the listing brokerage and Y is what you were going to cooperate and give to the selling brokerage. However, when a contract, a real estate contract come across from the buyer to the seller, they had that they were going to ask for X amount in that. Or maybe they put that they don't want any because the buyer wants to pay their own amount. Whatever that may be, if you had negotiated in the beginning X plus Y, this is the total amount that the listing firm is collecting, you cannot keep the Y. If it is Y minus
If it is
whatever,
divided
you
right here.
cannot keep whatever is left over. So you have to either do it the way and split it the way that it says in your original listing agreement as promised by the seller and agreed upon. You can split it that way and everybody has to disclose that. Or if there is any change to that as a real estate contract comes in, then you have to go back to your seller and make sure that they fully understand they're not asking for the full amount that you actually offered in the beginning. So therefore that goes back to you. It does not stay with me as the listing broker. Did that help to answer your question? It really.
Can I try?
Yes, absolutely.
I hated algebra, so I won't use X and Y, all right? But it really is just that simple. The buyer puts an amount in the offer that they're asking the seller to pay their agent. Turns out it's less than what the seller had agreed in a co-op split to pay. So if the seller's not paying that amount that they agreed in their listing, they're paying less because the buyer asked for less, then the overage stays with the seller. Does that answer it? Okay.
Okay, so page 98, multi-list service in the internet. We have added a sentence just so that the seller knows that you're not going to put this in the MLS to offer it. Should seller instruct listing firm to offer a cooperative fee pursuant to paragraph 9, such fee shall not be displayed within any MLS documentation or presentation. Let's turn over to page 106, and this is the start of the black line. So your new exclusive right to sell agreement residential is 10 pages, not 14 or 45 or whatever that the red line tells you. Okay, now, fourth category, real estate contracts. Okay, page 1, and the real estate contract is not 27 pages, but page 1 is basically the same format as before, but you can see with a red line, those categories of properties have been just kind of moved around a little bit. But it shouldn't affect the contract at all. Now we want to turn over to the agency page, which is page 120 of the scan. Okay, before we had 5 options, just like there's 5 options here. But the 5th option was non-representation disclosure. And we moved that, and I'll show you why and explain why a little bit later. So if you turn to if LaDonna scrolls, well, she scrolled to the next page. Do you see the red line where we redlined and marked out the non-representation paragraph that used to be there, and we moved it. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But we did add another option for agency representation, because we've always had, if there was no listing firm, like if you were working on a permission to show and there was no listing firm, you had that option to check D, but you didn't have the option to check anything if the buyer wasn't being represented by an agent. But now you do, because it may happen. Ideally, we hope it doesn't. Andrea probably gets heartburn thinking about someone thinking that they should do this without representation, but the consumer has the right now. Okay, so that paragraph is there appropriate for there being no buyer representation. Okay, under the merger clause, we added without participating brokers' written consent there. And then on to the next page, that paragraph continues with a red line that says this real estate contract may not be amended except in writing signed by both buyer and seller. Neither listing firm nor selling firm may amend this real estate contract by exchange of messages verbally or otherwise. This is placed in here to limit your risk, because we have, and Tim will speak to this in a minute, but he's had some instances where people have filed suits based upon they're not saying that, well, my agent sent a text and told them we were changing that piece of it, but then they never reduced it to writing. Okay, and then paragraph 29 is also a risk addition that Tim recommended, not necessarily connected to antitrust, but it does support overall antitrust. So paragraph 29, successors and assigns, this real estate contract shall be binding upon all heirs, successors, personal representatives, executors, administrators, and to the extent allowed in paragraph 24, assigns. And then also paragraph 30, the default paragraph, upon failure of buyer or seller to timely fulfill all obligations under this real estate contract, the non-defaulting party shall have all available rights and remedies provided by applicable law. And I'm going to let Tim speak to those three additions, paragraph 28, 29, and 30.
Yeah, the first one we've had actually, particularly in the post-COVID days when people were bidding for the highest price, we had a couple of different potential lawsuits, both thankfully solved, where an agent said, well, we have an offer for $350. Will your client go to $360? And they responded back, yes, they will. And they never reduced that to a change to an existing contract. And so I just want to make it very clear. We don't have the ability to modify a contract whatsoever. The successors and assigns, we've also had a couple of things happen the last couple of years where a buyer or seller has the audacity to croak in the middle of a transaction. And though that should be binding on their estate, we've had some lawyers and some courts that have questioned that, whether or not a buyer has to complete a sale or a seller has to complete a sale. We just made that clear. And then the last one, we think a contract, the law should cover a defaulted contract, but we just put that in there because we actually had a judge in Fort Smith ask whether or not you could actually sue for default if there wasn't a default clause. Kind of stunning, but that's what we had. So that's why we added those things in.
That's why we've had you for 40 years, right, Tim?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, good deal. Thank you for that. All right, now we're going to be on page 138 of the scan, and this is where we moved the non-representation disclosure here, and then there is a non-representation disclosure addendum. Prior to these changes, you could only choose A, B, or C, but now you can check all that apply, because sometimes the seller is an entity acting as the seller, and the buyer is a party acting as a buyer, and you didn't have the ability to check both of those. And then also the non-representation disclosure addendum. Now, this is not truly agency related. That's why we moved it to D. And I'm going to let, who likes to discuss that one? Doyle, Tim? You want to talk about that one?
Sure.
D? Okay.
Yeah. I will tell you, we've had this non-representation disclosure for a long time. The Pope County case says you can only get involved in a real estate transaction in a marketing capacity. It was really there for when agents act for their own account, when you're buying or selling property on your own. Let's not forget Regulation 10.1 says that when you do that, you have to keep the broker informed to get the broker's consent to that. You can't deal independently of your broker without their consent. And if you are in a transaction where you are the buyer or the seller, then you will check this box, fill out the non-representation disclosure form to make it clear that I'm acting as a principal in this transaction. And we told the brokers this morning, so when they make you do this, don't be surprised. And that is, even though you may be dealing on your own account and you've got these forms properly filled out, that broker has to maintain any monies that come into your possession, any earnest monies, et cetera, and has to maintain a complete transactional file on this, just as if you were handling it as a listing or a buyer agent.
Okay, now in the scan, we're going to turn over to page 139. And on page 139, the signature pages are on two separate pages now. Okay, and it's confusing looking at the red line. So we're going to jump over to the black line signature pages, 159 of the black line scan. So I think this is most helpful. So if you're working with a buyer and you're submitting this as an offer, here's where they sign it. Okay, now, if you're a listing broker and you're presenting this offer to your seller, then your options are on page 160, page 17 of this contract. And we've reordered this. Okay, before the rejected, counter offered, or buyer informed of notification of existing real estate contract addendum was at the very bottom. Now we put it at the top if it's one of those three things. If it's one of those three things, then you check it, have your sellers initial it, then you need to sign it and your broker needs to sign it to indicate that both parties have seen it, whether it's rejected, counteroffered, or is in second place. Okay, do the sellers sign this right here if one of those three are checked at the top? No, they initial, because it's not a complete contract between a buyer and a seller. Okay. But then if they're accepting the contract and we're going to enter in between the buyer and seller, then everything below the black midline there would be filled in and signed and submitted for a complete contract. Page 161 of the scan, and this is that multi-party compensation disclosure. How to handle this disclosure was a piece of settlement that the PAG had been following closely. After feedback at June's Risk Reduction Committee meeting, we and several states handling it from input with the DOJ response, this is where we arrived and where we feel we can be the most transparent to meet, number one, what the settlement requires and what Arkansas law requires. Now, we've seen this multi-party compensation agreement before, but we've utilized it when home warranty was paying us a fee to sell, to sell a home warranty, or paying us a bonus or something. We had to disclose that. The thing that I want to point out is right in the center, and this was always there. This is regulation. This is already existing Arkansas law. According to Arkansas Real Estate Commission Regulation 8.5C, when acting as agent in the sale or management of property, a licensee shall not accept any commission, rebate, profit, payment, compensation, or other valuable consideration from any source in connection with the property without full written disclosure to the party represented by the licensee and Regulation 8.5D. A licensee shall not accept compensation from more than one party without full written disclosure to all parties of the transaction. This is a conversation that you really need to have with your principal brokers and how they want you to handle this. I've heard some principal brokers in the room feel that this multi-party compensation disclosure needs to be included with every offer on a property. I've heard other principal brokers say this needs to be included when the seller is paying the buyer's agent, because that's multi-party compensation. So we want to marry what the settlement requires and what is compliant with the Arkansas law. And so this page, let's turn to the black line version because it's easier to read and easier to look at. So if a seller is paying a buyer's agent compensation, this is where you disclose it. This is where it needs to go. So the title companies know what they're authorized by the seller to pay on the broker side of the settlement statement. Because as you know, we're not supposed to show a buyer the seller side, nor are we supposed to show a seller the buyer side of the settlement statement. So this is where a title company, a lender, whoever is filling out and filling in those ALTAs and settlement statements, this is what gives them the authority to take the seller's funds and pay the buyer's agent a portion of that. It's also the flip side. What if the buyer is paying the listing agent side from some strange negotiations that went on? Don't y'all love this profession? Because nothing is ever the same, is it? Do you ever have two transactions that are the same? So I mean, that's part of what I love about it. It's something new every day, and you wake up and you don't even know exactly what your day is going to hold. But this is where you would disclose that.
Yeah, I think what Melissa wants me to talk about, I shared something, cautionary tale, if you will, with the broker meeting this morning. Share it with you as well. They probably took it a little more serious than you will, since their license on the line, right? So for everyone in the room who's a parent,
Yours is too.
you do what?
Yours is on the line too. As
Yeah,
practitioners,
right.
Technically.
Well, but in a lawsuit, it's probably more money coming out of their pocket than yours. But anyway, that said, everyone in the room who's a parent understands that if you set rules without consequences, you don't have rules, right? And so I've seen some of the conversations about this that people think that you don't see. That what happens if I don't have a buyer agent agreement? What happens if I have a buyer and, you know, it just wasn't convenient when I met them the first time to really bring it up. And so I showed 4 or 5 properties, and finally they picked one, and we wrote an offer, and we did the buyer agent agreement then. If everyone would admit in the room, that's probably pretty much how you do it now. But going forward, you can't. And so the deal closes, and there was no problem. The buyer was happy with their agent. But somewhere after the closing, and that's when these things come up, the buyer thinks that there's a failure to disclose, that the seller knew something, they didn't tell them, they can't get satisfaction out of it. And so they go see their attorney. Attorneys prospect like we prospect. They're always looking for new business, right? So you think they don't know about this settlement agreement, and they don't know the target dates, the 17th of August, and they don't know the requirements we now have? They do. And so that disgruntled buyer goes to their attorney, starts talking to them about what they think went wrong, that they're not happy with. And the first thing the attorney's going to ask for is the same thing the commission asked for. Let me see your paperwork. And they noticed that date of the buyer agent agreement, same date of the contract. Well, the attorney's going to say, did your buyer's agent show you properties prior to this? Or was this the only property they showed you and they wrote a contract the same day? Oh, no, they worked with me for weeks. We looked at several properties. This is just the one. They had me sign that buyer agent agreement when I signed the contract. Bingo. That's how it'll get enforced.
Caught.
You will get sued. Your broker will get sued because now you are out from under the protection, the provisions of the settlement agreement. You violated the tenets of the settlement agreement. Now you are fair game. And so I want to share with you, this is not a real estate commission issue. They will not have or be looking at jurisdiction over this. There may be other things pertaining to it that the commission will eventually weigh in on, but this is that settlement. And right now you're under that umbrella. And as long as you follow, I don't like it. No one in this room likes it. I've said before, this is what we get when non-practitioners negotiate on our behalf. That's exactly what happened. But like it or not, it is our new normal. And we're going to have to abide by it. So quit fretting over it, but figure out how you're going to do it. But to try to work around it is going to leave you in a bad situation. So
back in the very beginning, we were talking about how are we going to find out if we have a list of 5 or 6 houses we're trying to set up appointments, but we want to know if and how much the seller's going to pay the buyer's agent.
Yep.
And Tim, you mentioned get a text or something from the listing agent. Is that enforceable in court?
You know, it probably is. It's because it's a party, but it's between you and the other broker that's there. So it's, you know, you preserve the text, depends on the term of it. Under Arkansas law, the statute of fraud says it has to be a writing signed by the party to be charged. Is it signed when they send it a response to you? But I would take that case broker versus broker if you have an exchange of text that explain what the cooperative share would be. Yes.
Well, I just really have a concern, like you all said, a lot of agents do not get back to you right away. And when you're sitting there trying to line up appointments for the next day and you can't find out then if anything's going to be paid. I mean, it seems like NABOR or somebody, we need to form a way for this to happen with everybody.
Sadly, we can't. Under the MLS settlement, it's going to have to be, as a matter of ethics and courtesy and fiduciary duty to your seller, if somebody calls you and says, I would like to show number 1 Elm Street, but I need you to call me back and tell me my buyer doesn't have enough money to pay my fee, I need a cooperative share, and you don't get a call back, that's an impediment to that listing getting sold in a potential breach of your fiduciary duty. So I hope everybody will be, the awareness will be heightened to this and the necessity of having that communication in order to help you discharge your duties to your buyers and sellers.
There was not a form that we would be able to create in terms of NABOR or the state that would be circumventing the agreement or getting cute, as Tim would like to call it. What NAR did encourage was for each office to come up with their own broker to broker agreement. And you could utilize that to ratify that commission once you're ready to make an offer on that property on behalf of your client.
Per property, not a blanket.
Per property, not a blanket agreement between brokerages, but almost it would be something you could utilize that might look similar to your referral form. And you could utilize that to ratify that agreement per property.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
My quick question is on this existing listing addendum, if we already have a listing agreement in place with the breakdown of the co-op, do we still need to?
Yes.
Okay.
Because of the class action waiver verbiage that's on there, that's not on your current listing agreement.
Yeah, but more than that, you need to have the statement in there that you need to have them agree that the commissions are not set by law or regulation.
Right.
And
Okay.
that's not our present form. So that's required by the settlement.
Okay.
So that,
Thank you.
yes, ma'am.
Yes, and I would also, a piece that you might not have thought about, you know, all of you have clients that you've probably been working with for 2 or 3 years showing them property, and you've developed a relationship with them, and you just, when they call you, you just jump out and go show them the property, maybe investors or whatever. You can't do that without signing a buyer agency agreement. So any current existing relationship that you have with buyers, moving forward, you should have the mindset of, let's get a buyer agency agreement signed before we go see any properties, even though we've been looking at properties for a month or two together. Okay? Yes.
This is not a practical question, but a philosophical one. I'm just curious what the initial purpose of removing the compensation from the MLS and how this is expected to benefit the consumers in the long
When
run.
we have the answer to that,
Yeah.
we're all gonna be cheering loudly.
Okay, so it's not a stupid
It's
question. I
the,
thought,
it's
why
the
why am I
head
not
scr-
getting this?
It's the absolute head scratcher of the whole thing.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
This was certainly not something that we were in favor of. This was just the agreement that was worked out. So we are trying to abide by that settlement agreement.
And it's about I mean, we've used the word transparency and disclosure. It's about transparency and disclosure. And so logic tells you that removing it from the MLS prevents disclosure. But that's not the way the lawyers saw it. Yes, sir.
Tim, you're probably gonna give me a quick thumbs down on this, but to my knowledge, the MLS documents, the little tab up there, the little sheets, that does not aggregate anywhere. That cannot be a location to put anything, but as far as commissions?
No.
I'm not sure I know your question, but if it's MLS related, it cannot have an offer of compensation. If
We,
it's in it-
we cannot use our
They even
MLS.
They even dropped a parenthetical,
Period.
you can look at in paragraph 58, that kind of said, in case we don't know for sure exactly what we're talking about, parentheses, there can't be any way to circumvent the requirement that MLS is not be used.
Like I said, quick thumbs down.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions.
Yes.
With the existing listings, with our new forms or the forms that we have to give our currently active listings, is that an opportunity then for them to, hopefully not, hopefully we're showing our value. Is that now an opportunity for them to negotiate their current listing commission that they're paying to us?
Well, hopefully you have that established in
Right.
your listing fee. And you're gonna have to be really good with your script on how
Sure.
you,
Yeah,
how you
but you're
visit
right.
with them.
Anytime you present an addendum, it's certainly, and not only that, they've read all the stuff in all the newspapers, including when you read in the New York Times and places like the USA Today that we finally ended the standard 6% commission. That's my favorite one, because I missed that day.
Right.
When we were dictated that we all have to charge a standard 6% commission. I sort of missed that day in class. And so I think I think what Melissa said is right. You're gonna have to have a discussion internally on exactly how you present that to buyers and sellers. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. And then my second question is regarding the MLS, not trying to circumvent them as far as trying to get cute, as you would say, but offering buyer concessions and letting the buyer allocate those funds however they see fit. Is that something that we are allowed to put in there at
No.
all?
Because
Okay.
of Fannie.
Seller concessions are certainly okay, but you need to be specific with what
Or seller concessions, that's what I meant.
yeah, seller,
towards the
I knew
buyer.
what- I knew what you meant. Seller concessions are okay, but be very careful about that in the MLS, you should not communicate that the seller will also pay X% of a buyer's agent fee.
Sure. Yep. All right. Thanks.
Will there be any changes if you're having an open house, how you present yourself to the people just touring a home?
Yeah.
So Susie, there's a thing, implied agency. So if a buyer just comes in or a looky-loo comes into an open house and they're just walking around, you're holding that open house on behalf of your seller. But once they engage you and start asking questions, you have to have that conversation about agency and representation, because they may not want representation. They might share something with you that might give the seller the advantage in negotiating. So you just have to have that discussion pretty early on once they engage with you. And then if they want represented, buyer's agency agreement.
Thank you, everybody. Yay.